The workshop tonight is on scientific ethics, and so that's a very important topic, and it's actually something that is of increasing importance as far as the federal government is concerned. So the federal government is a major organization that funds research in the United States, and they're very concerned about how research is conducted. Okay? And so the topic of ethics is one of the very big topics that comes up with respect to how research is conducted. So the two big agencies that we deal with in the federal government that are concerned about ethics include the National Science Foundation, who funds our research, and also the National Institutes of Health, which funds a lot of research related to the kinds of things that you guys are interested in. And there's other federal agencies that do as well, but in terms of the kinds of things that we do, those are going to be the ones that are the most prominent federal agencies that are interested in ethics of research. When I say the word ethics, okay, I think an image pops up in some people's minds, and I'd like to ask you, when I say the word ethics, what pops up in your mind? What does the word ethics mean? Yeah. Moral standards, very good. What else? Yeah. Values. Values are very important. What else? How about right and wrong? Right? Credibility. Actually, credibility happens because of these things, right? So how do we get credibility? By what? By being trustworthy, by exhibiting some of these qualities that we're talking about, by being ethical is part of that. Okay? So having credibility is something that ultimately we want to all achieve, right? Okay. So ethics is really important. When I say ethics, and I think bad ethics, that is somebody who's on the wrong side of the ethics equation, what kinds of behaviors do we think about? Lying, cheating, disrespect, okay? What else? What? Plagiarism. That's a very good one. What else? There's a lot of things we can think about. Use your imagination, folks. Fabrication, dishonesty. What's that? Bias, manipulation. Okay. All these things contribute to, shall we say, an ethical climate that is not exactly one that we want to be doing research in. Research is based upon certain assumptions that we do that make it possible. For example, if I'm a professor and I am doing research on a topic and I do an experiment and I say, here's the results of my experiment, and my experiment shows that if I give this drug to this cell, it will cure it of a virus. Okay? Now, if I do that and I go to a journal and I tell the journal, I took these cells, I treated them with this drug, these cells got cured of this virus, the journal is going to take a look at that. They're going to look at the information that I presented, and if the information I presented is reasonable, they're going to publish that. They're not going to come to my laboratory, and they're not going to check to see if it's there. My word, based on the fact that I said I did the experiments this way, and these were the results that I saw, my word was sufficient for the journal to publish that information. Okay? I had credibility. Okay? And I had credibility because the ethical standards that are underneath all of the research that's done rely on honesty, openness, integrity. Okay? All of these qualities are there, and they're assumed to be there. And if I exhibit behaviors where I say, for example, that this drug eliminated the virus from this cell, and I know it didn't eliminate the virus from this cell, the journal's going to publish something that's not true, right? People are going to read this journal, and they're going to assume that everything in it was true. They may use that information. People may be harmed as a result of what's happened there, right? So the honesty, the openness, the integrity, all of these things have very important implications. Right? So ethical standards are really, really critical for us to think about. Okay? There are some things that we've heard in the news about places where people are doing research where ethical standards really come into question. Can anybody think of any research results they've heard of or experiments that they've heard of where ethical standards are called into question? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Okay. Okay, so you've got a lot of things that happened in that story, a lot of things that would be what we would describe as unethical. So I said openness was important, truthfulness was important, slanting results. Somebody said bias. Okay, and so going into a problem with an agenda, there are people who approach scientific investigations with an agenda meaning that they have some sort of point that they want to try to make. This person might not have liked gay men, for example. Might be an example of that kind of thing. These are problematic. How many people in here have ever heard of the Tuskegee experiments? Yeah. That's probably one of the worst examples of unethical scientific research. For those of you who don't know about it, it was a set of experiments that were done on African-American men back in about the 1930s at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And the experiment was following African-American men who they knew had syphilis. Okay? And they basically wanted to see what happened with the progression of syphilis. So they let half of them be untreated. When you do an experiment, you have a treatment group and you have an untreatment group, even though they knew what was going to happen if they didn't treat these men. And they followed them through and they let them go and suffer the consequences of syphilis. It's absolutely horrid. And syphilis, I don't know if you're familiar with it, is a horrid disease as it progresses. The men did not know they were part of an experiment. They did not know the consequences of the experiment. They didn't have any say in the experiment whatsoever. Okay? And there are many examples that we can give. But because, and that experiment wasn't even really revealed until about the 1970s and 1980s when people became aware of it. And when they started to become aware of it, it was actually one of the things that really made a push for the concern about ethical research. Ethical research. Now, we're not going to go out and do the Tuskegee experiment. There's nobody here who's going to do that. But it means that whenever we do an experiment, we have to think about the consequences of the experiment that we're doing. So if we're doing experiments that, for example, involve people, we have to take special considerations. You may be doing experiments that don't involve people, but you could say, okay, well, how many people have heard about animal rights? Everybody here has heard about animal rights, right? Where does animal rights fit into that ethical equation? Okay? So cruelty. Do we want to be exhibiting cruel behaviors towards animals that we're working with? Nobody would want to do that, right? What we have on the OSU campus, for example, is we have various boards that oversee the research that's done on the campus, and they have to approve certain types of experiments to ensure that there's safety, that there's ethical considerations about how things are done, whether those experiments involve people, whether those experiments involve animals, whether those experiments involve things that might involve the public safety in some way. What if I were working with Ebola virus? What would you tell me? Keep it away from me, right? Okay? So thinking about public safety might be a very important ethical consideration if I were working on Ebola virus on the OSU campus, right? Well, fortunately, we don't have Ebola virus on the OSU campus, and I can absolutely assure you of that, at least in terms of experimentation. And the reason is because the federal government, the Ebola virus or some viruses like that are so dangerous that they would require extraordinarily special containment in order to for experimenters to work with those. So I couldn't just decide tomorrow to decide, oh, well, I think I'm going to work on Ebola virus because I could get the Nobel Prize if I fix Ebola virus, okay? Because I would have to go through a very, very extensive and lengthy approval process and have major construction of safety facilities that would stop that Ebola virus from spreading. So containment can be an important concern. I'd like you to think a little bit about other things that we talk about frequently for which there are ethical considerations. Can anybody think of any specific examples besides specific experiments, but topics? I'll give you an example. Stem cells. What do we hear about stem cells? What's that? Okay, so some experiments involve fertilized eggs involving human cells, and those fertilized eggs involve fetal cells. And so the taking and using of those where there might be harm to or damage to a fetus would be obviously something we would be very concerned about. Okay, so stem cells raise issues. There was a very famous, how many people have heard, or how many people have this notion that vaccines cause autism? How many people have ever heard that? Vaccines cause autism. Okay. What's that? Heard of it, don't believe it. Okay. So this is a very common perception that vaccines cause autism. Okay. When I asked you about that, I saw about 75% of you were at least aware of it. You'd at least heard of that claim. Whether you believed it or not is another matter, but you've heard that claim. If I went out into the... Yeah. You did? Okay. So that's what that helps then, doesn't it? How many people had heard about it before talking to Dr. Cole? Okay, so most of you had heard of it, all right? Vaccines, of course, don't cause autism. The person who made that claim, all right, forged his data. He later went to jail for forgery, okay? And as a consequence of this, what's happened is 75% of the American public think that vaccines cause autism. So parents are not vaccinating their children. We see the consequences of ethical violations because now what's happening is children who are not being vaccinated are getting things like whooping cough. Last year in California, you know there were 40 kids who died of whooping cough? That's amazing, right? To think about the fact that some person who fabricates data has that consequence, and that's in California alone. Okay? So when we have ethical transgressions and we have ethical problems that arise, we really do cause a very big set of problems. So it's very important for us to think about the ethics by which we do things. Okay? Now, why do you suppose people do this? Why do I go out and say, for example, that autism is caused by a vaccine? What makes people do that? Fame. What else? There might be a financial incentive in some cases. I'm not sure it was here, but there might be a financial incentive. Yeah? What else? Okay, what would they get by bias? Yeah, in general, bias, I think, actually comes about for a couple of reasons. Some are very planned. That, you know, if you keep, I know people who do an experiment like 300 times because they're determined that every time that the result that they get is not right, and they keep looking for the one result that they want to see. That's bias, right? And that's really a problem. Yeah, Cameron. So there's the bias is what you're saying. Yeah, okay.
For a while, people were talking about trace amounts of mercury and combating a lot of nurses against food vaccine and stuff like that.
Okay.
People have things against that.
Let's expand the question a little wider. Let's think about why is it that people would exhibit dishonesty with respect to research? Or why is it that people might, one of the things that happens with scientific dishonesty is people will at times do what we call fudge data. If I say fudge data, what does that mean? Make things up. Okay? I make data that, or I change the data so that it shows the point that I'm trying to make. Why do people do things like that? Yeah. Issue with being wrong. Okay. Okay. Good. What else? Yeah. Uniqueness. Okay. Yeah. Cameron? Okay, so breakthrough for a job. Boy, that's a big one. What's at the root of a breakthrough for a job? Money, economics, okay? When you're talking about people who are doing research, one of the things that you will find, or one of the very biggest pressures that happen with respect to research, is that research is done because there's funding to do research. We have a grant that's paying you to do research with professors because the federal government is funding that. And the laboratories in which you're going to be working are funded mostly by the federal government as well. And how do people get funded? How do you suppose grants get funded? Results. Data and publications drive everything. The more data that you have, the more publications that you get. The more publications you get, the more likely you will get funded. You see pressure? Right? So if you want to be a professor, one of the routes to becoming a professor is starting out as an assistant professor. And as an assistant professor, your job is to go out and get as many grants as you can, publish as many papers as you can, establish as big of a reputation as you can. And you see the same sort of pressures on a person's career that you see in the money side of, well, I need this data for this experiment. Okay? Do you think people do it just simply because they're dishonest? Yeah? That's a pessimistic view, isn't it? I think there are some people that are like that, but I think the more common thing that we see is that people do things that are unethical because of various pressures. They are dishonest at their very root. I will agree with you. But I don't think that they do it simply to be dishonest. I think people do it because they have pressures of job, they have pressures of publications, and they may have pressures of time. I've got to get this thing done. Believe me, time is on my mind right now, right? And so, wow, I'm not going to go do this. I screwed up. I'm not going to do this experiment again. Here's my data. Here's the experiment. I know what this thing is, right? I know it's going to be right. That's another thing people do. Is they're assumed that well, it's quite clear what the result would be. Do I actually have to do the experiment? Okay, important considerations. Okay. What are the responsibilities of researchers? And I'm thinking not only of the people who are overseeing the research and doing the research, but also you who are working in laboratories and doing research. You have certain responsibilities that you have as well. What are all the responsibilities of people doing research? Honesty. So and it's a very good point, guilty by association can be a real problem. It might not seem like that, but I'll tell you one of the things that happens. Let's say that I am a graduate student, and I am working on my PhD in your laboratory. And I'm as honest as the day is long. And I've got great things that I've done, but you or someone in your laboratory fudges data and gets caught in it. What's going to happen to me? Well, I came out of your lab. You're going to have a very famous lab for this. Okay? How many people heard about the cold fusion thing a few years ago? Anybody know about that? Okay, that's your. I'm too old. Forget that then. Okay, but there are things where there are either errors or there are dishonesty that happens, and if you're associated with that, by being associated with it, it can have a very big impact on you. So if I were in a lab that was, found to be acting dishonestly, that would have a major impact on my career. Okay. So that guilt by association can be a very important consideration. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about with respect to considerations of this are, and I've got other things I'll talk about as well, but the last thing I want to talk about with respect to consideration of this gets back to the Tuskegee experiment. Okay, and it also relates to, and I forget your name, what is it? Kirsty, yeah, Kirsty. I'm still learning names, guys. And I now have your picture on my wall, so that I sit there and I stare at the names and I get the names all down. So what Kirsty said originally about that experiment was that these gay men had no knowledge of what was going on. They didn't know anything about it, and they were subjects without having a say in it. Having a say in things is really, really important if you're working with human subjects. Okay? We have to do, when we do an experiment that involves human beings, we have to do something called informed consent. Does anybody know what informed consent means? Yeah, Kirsty, you tell them about the experiment. That's part of it. You tell them how they're going to be a part of it. Cameron? You get their verbal permission. There's more. Yeah. You tell them how this experiment might affect them in some way. Okay. What else? I think Kyle's worked with you. This is good. Yes. Okay. So they have to sign a document that says, I understand what's going to happen with this, and I willingly agree to do it. Yes?
Consent is like an ongoing approval, so
Mm-hmm.
they have to be allowed to take themselves out if they want to.
They can take themselves out if they want to. So I'll give you a really good example here. Okay? A really good example is, let's say that I'm teaching you guys in a class. Okay? And I say, okay, I'm doing an experiment, and I want to find out if my teaching methods are effective or not. And I'm going to publish this work, and in order for me to do this, you're going to fill out a survey, kind of like the survey I gave you earlier. By the way, I'm not going to publish this. Okay? All right? I'm going to take this survey, and if you will take this survey, I'm going to give you 5 points of extra credit. What are you going to do? You're going to take the survey. All right? And if you don't take the survey, I'm going to knock 5 points off your grade. There's a consequence of not participating, right? There's a reward for participating. The people who decide, hey, this survey, it really isn't something that I want to be a part of, okay? They're asking me for my Social Security number, and I don't think I want to give them my Social Security number, right? But if I don't do this, then my grade is going to suffer. I can't easily withdraw from this as a consequence of that, okay? So informed consent includes all of these considerations. It includes the ability to withdraw yourself from that. It includes the fact that there should be no consequences if you do withdraw. Really, really important considerations. Okay? All right. Now, the last thing, I keep promising saying the last thing, but I think the last thing I'm going to talk about here, okay, is something called intellectual property. When I say intellectual property, I'm talking about something. Has Dr. Cole talked about intellectual property? Okay. All this, I got something new here. Then we'll see how well you guys get this. Intellectual property. What is it? What does it sound like? Ideas? What else? Original idea. Okay. What else? Invention or music? I was going to ask some examples, and you gave me 2 examples right there. Okay. Inventions or music. Okay. Other examples of intellectual property? How about art? Something we draw? How about something that we write? Okay. There's 2 areas of intellectual property that we primarily get concerned about. One's what's called copyright, and one is what we call patent. And people frequently mix up those 2 terms, and they're really very different kinds of things. I'm going to ask you, before I tell you what the answer is, I'm going to ask you what you think they are. What is a copyright cover and what is a patent cover? Does anybody know? Yes, sir. They actually both mean you have to get permission. Okay? Yes. Patents do have a more limited time frame in which they cover things. Yep. The what? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Patents don't go that long. Patents go much shorter periods of time than that. Yeah.
Patents are for like ideas.
Excellent.
Stuff, and copyrights for like research and art.
Okay. So patents cover what we call inventions, what you're calling ideas. So when I go out and I invent the new Tesla car, okay, I might have patents that cover that. If I go out and I design a new drug, a patent might cover that. If I go out and I write a new song, a copyright might cover that. So copyrights cover what we call creative work, which are something that I could sit and write, I could draw, I could sing, I could play, I could record, I could make a movie of. A movie would be copyrighted. But if I'm making something that involves a process, then that's a patent. So that's why drugs are covered by patents and so forth. To give you an idea, patents run for about 20 years. Copyrights run for, well, the current law today says they run for, I think it's 50 years after the death of the creator. So if the creator lives for 90 years, that would be 140 years that a patent would exist. Now, here's something that may surprise you. Everything that you do is copyright. Did you know that? Everything you've got on that sheet right there is copyright. Amazing, huh? Now, we tend to not realize that. People think, when they see the copyright symbol, that you have to file that somewhere or whatever, but that's not true. You actually have copyright on everything that you've done. So if I were to take your sheet of paper right there, and I were to make lots of copies of it, and I were to start selling those copies on eBay, then you could come to me with a lawyer and say, that's my work, it's copyright by me, and Kevin Ahern owes me a lot of money. And you would win. Okay? So when we talk about permissions, the reason we have to get permissions is because the creator owns that. Okay? So when we talk about the passing around of music and so on and so forth, those are clearly copyrighted things. And yes, people do get in trouble because they pass around things that they shouldn't because they don't own the rights to them. Is there a question back here? Uh-huh. Good question. Does it have to say copyright? There was a time when it had to say copyright. The copyright law as it exists right now does not require that. You would simply have to show 2 things if you were to go to court with what I just described. One is you would have to show it was your work, and 2, you would have to show when you created it. Okay? And the reason you have to show when you created it is if you created it after 1970, it's automatically done. If you created it before 1970, then it would have to have the copyright sign on it. Yeah. I'm sorry? So don't you have to pay for copyrights and patents? To get a copyright or a patent, to get a patent, there's a fairly lengthy legal process to get one, and you pay a small fee, but you pay much more in legal fees to an attorney to file it. So I have a patent. I have a patent for a process that I invented back in the early 1990s, okay? And OSU paid for the cost of that patent, all right? Do you know how much it cost to pay the attorneys to get the patent? It took about 6 months for the attorneys working on the patent to finish the work, and that included going back and forth with the federal government. It cost them $30,000. Yeah. So when OSU said, we will pay for the attorneys, and we'll take a chunk of the royalties for that, I said, by all means. And I was very happy that I did, okay? So if you come into my office, you'll see I actually have the plaque on my wall that says what the patent is for. If you're curious, I'll tell you about it sometime. I won't go through it here. But patents, because of the fact that you have to get attorneys involved, make it much more expensive. To get a copyright, no, you don't. Okay? You don't. There was a time when you used to have to send off to the Copyright Office and file your work and indicate that was there. And that's one thing that you can do. You could, for example, take your work, you could send it to the Copyright Office and say, I have the feeling Kevin Ahern is going to take this and do it. And they would have it on file so that if tomorrow I went out and I copied your work and I did something with it, the Copyright Office would say, look, we've had this ever since this date. He's done it since then. It's clearly her work. Okay? But you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. Okay, good. This is very good. So, music, videos, television, art, paintings, any of these things are copyrightable. And these are all in the category that we call intellectual property. And we call it intellectual property because these are all things that are products of human minds. That's a very important thing. It has to be a product of a human mind. You can't patent something, okay? You can't patent something that is inherent to nature. Okay? Now that actually gets to be a fine line that I won't go into. Sometimes people get patents for genes and things like that, and it's kind of complicated how that works. But I can't go out and I can't patent you. You're already there, right? I can't patent a tree that already exists, right? I can't patent something that's there. But let's say I genetically modified the tree so that it started producing grapefruits on one branch and oranges on the other branch, okay? That was something that I made, I created. It was a product of my endeavor. That would be something that I could patent. Does that make sense? Okay, so patents and copyright will always have a component of human interaction with them. Okay. The last, I keep saying last thing, but okay, I won't do one more. How about that? I think we've done enough here tonight. What I would like to do would be to ask if you guys have any comments or questions about what I've had to say with respect to ethics, and go with that. So, any thoughts? Yes? Yeah, good question. So if I sit out here in the quad and I watch people doing something, do I have to get their permission to publish about that? Is that a good example? Okay. What do you guys think? No, over here. Why not?
Because you're in a public area.
In a public area.
And you're not, like, asking or anything.
Okay.
You don't know their, like, personal information.
Okay. So, first of all, I will tell you I'm not an expert in this. So if the lawyers come get me, I'm in trouble. But what the two of you just said is basically correct. Okay? So it's not just the public part of it, but it's the public part of it combined with the fact that there's no identifiable information. So one of the things that's involved in human research on human beings is that when you have to go file something that's called IRB, Institutional Review Board Approval, you have to they take into consideration that when this is published, will there be any identifiable information about people in there? Okay? Because if there is, there's potentially harm. Let's say I see the person out there, and I'm watching everybody when I'm out under the tree, and I see, okay, these people over here jaywalked. They broke the law, right? So if I publish that and I publish their names there, and I've got a video of them showing them jaywalking, haven't I violated their privacy And haven't I taken advantage of them without them knowing or being a part of that? The other part that comes up with human research that's very important is the publication part of it. When I go to publish it, now I'm making an example of a person, and that jaywalking example is that they're minding their own business. They're not doing anything that should necessarily flag them for being there, but I've put them there. I am going to benefit from publishing this work, all right? And I need to make sure I have their okay to do that. Yes?
But if you did a behavior study where, you wrote down how many times, males versus females jaywalk
Yes?
during, the duration of, a month or something.
Yep.
Do you have any names?
Yep. What do you guys think? She said, what if I just went out there and I watched people jaywalking and I compared numbers of males versus females jaywalking, and I wanted to publish that, would I be able to do that? Mostly yeses. Yes? That's another matter, right? So, I see what you're saying. So if I went out and I said, I'm going to be watching you, you're thinking this might influence, we're going to be putting everybody on camera going across this thing, and that would, I have a feeling that would influence the results. Yeah.
Yeah, I did a study of consumer bag choice.
Oh, uh-huh.
Consumers using plastic bags versus paper bags the year before the plastic bag ban began last and the year after. And we had to stay across the street so that nobody would see us recording them.
Uh-huh.
And we did age and gender.
Okay.
Based on what we thought they were, but we didn't
Interesting.
publish that.
Interesting. I heard one. This was one that had consent, but it was a really interesting sort of experiment on interactions between human beings. So they had a person who was working in at a cash register, and they had all these people that were coming up and paying and so forth. And what they would do is the young woman was told, okay, touch this person's hand when you give them their change back, and don't touch this person's hand. So they would keep track of whether she touched a person's hand or didn't touch a person's hand. And then they went out and they surveyed them. So of course they're asking them for their consent to do this, but they surveyed them and said, how do you feel? And do you know what they found? Was that the percentage of people whose feeling was very positive was much greater if their hand had been touched than if it wasn't. It had nothing. Yeah. And it says something about human interaction. It was kind of cool. So I don't know why I thought about that, but that just came up. You had a comment.
Yes. So in that matter, you were talking about the jaywalking,
Yes.
breaking the law, and then the ethical values. Where does that kind of conflict? Because you do not necessarily have an obligation to report, but since it's not sure if it's a crime or a violation.
Mm-hmm.
Related to your ethical and how would that conflict at all?
Okay, so I'm not sure I understand, but let me just try to paraphrase what I think you're saying. Okay, so you're saying that you have knowledge of a crime being committed, and if you don't report a crime being committed, are you being unethical? Is that the question?
Because you don't have the
Okay. I think, okay, so here's what would happen, all right? All of these are factors when you go to publish your work. If you are walking down the street and you see a person, I don't know, let's say littering, and you think, that's really ridiculous. They're throwing their junk out there. They shouldn't be throwing their junk out there. It's illegal to litter. I'm going to take a picture of this person. I'm going to send it to the police department. Okay? I think that's perfectly reasonable to do. So there's not a problem in reporting a crime or talking about a crime. The only concern comes up when you publish your work. Okay? So if you were to go and say, if you went to the newspaper, I've got a picture of this person, here they are, they're guilty, I put them in the paper, something's going to happen. What do you suppose is going to happen if you do that? You're not going to be liked. What else is going to happen? What else is going to be a consideration? That person will be thought negatively of, and that leads to what I'm thinking about here. Libel and slander. So that's an accusation, right? So if I go and do that, and this person hasn't been convicted of this, and I say that they've done that, I've actually libeled or slandered them. Okay, and they actually